So it is a beautiful sunny day in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I am kind of on the periphery of the Greenwood Historic District. I had traveled to Tulsa to learn about an innovation ecosystem centered around Black entrepreneurship there. But I knew that in Tulsa, you can't explore the future without first acknowledging the past. As you're walking, the sidewalks are pretty wide over here, and every now and then, you know, when you look down, you see these little plaques that just let you know, hey, something was here before. I was familiar with the history of Greenwood, which in the early 1900s was a vibrant, well-to-do Black neighborhood with shops, restaurants, grocery stores, hotels, barbershops, and offices. Greenwood even had its own school system and bank and hospital. But I was sure there was still a lot I didn't know. So I headed to Greenwood Rising Black Wall Street History Center to learn more from Phil Armstrong, its executive director.
Hi, Vanessa. Great to meet you. Welcome to Greenwood Rising. First time in Tulsa?
Phil met me in the lobby of the History Center's brand new building and graciously offered to take me on a tour through the museum. Phil told me that Black Wall Street, as it was called, would never have generated the wealth that it did if it weren't for the fact that the African Americans who lived there were landowners.
So you own land in 1866 in Oklahoma. You got power, you got money. And then the oil and gas discovery, and everybody became millionaires overnight.
At the same time that Greenwood was growing, racial tensions in the U.S. were heightening. During the so-called Red Summer of 1919, white mobs looted and destroyed dozens of Black communities across the country. In Oklahoma, the Ku Klux Klan was growing quickly, attracting poor whites who felt resentful toward the wealthy, thriving Black community in Greenwood. And on May 30th, 1921, when a young Black man named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white woman in an elevator, the racial animosities simmering under the surface in Tulsa exploded. Hundreds were killed, 1,000 homes destroyed, and millions were lost in property damage. Today, thanks to the works of historians as well as media like The Watchmen and HBO's Lovecraft Country, more and more people know what happened that day. But fewer people realize what happened next.
By 1922, they started rebuilding the first building back on Greenwood and Archer. Within 5 years, by 1926, 80 to 90% of Greenwood is rebuilt, which is remarkable.
Over the decades, Greenwood once again became a thriving community. But then, in the 1960s, large swaths of the community were destroyed again, this time by urban renewal and a highway. Phil walked me to an exhibit at the front of the museum that consists of a series of viewports hung along the wall. Each viewport shows a photograph of a street or an area in Greenwood before urban renewal. And then it shifts, turning into the same scene today. And because Tulsa is kind of a small town, Phil then called up the viewport's creator, Trey Thaxton, a CEO and entrepreneur in Tulsa, to tell me more.
And I want to introduce you to the gentleman that I told you about. He's the man in my book. He's the man in my book. Yes.
I'm Vanessa.
Nice to meet you, Vanessa.
I asked Trey if any of the images had stuck with him over time. And he walked me to one with a little girl in an alley, taken around the 1940s.
I believe it's this one right here. A young girl looking right at the camera, just with a cafe behind her, and she's kind of leaning up against the building, just showing that life and how this trolleyway was going straight through Greenwood, who dropped people off at different restaurants and clubs and businesses. Like, you can see that there was actual life here. And then fast forwarding to the 2021 photo, and there's a dumpster and a fence going through it. There's a highway cutting right over where the train tracks used to be. It kind of gives you a real sense of, like, this just decimated the life that was here. It really divided North Tulsa, not just North and South Tulsa, but divided North Tulsa as well, and cut off people from what was there before and their things they were used to and their resources. So there's lasting damage from that happening that still hasn't been addressed yet.
Phil explained that the highway was the last straw in Greenwood. After that, many African Americans left.
People who knew what was here before, how they rebuilt it, and then here they go and they destroy it again. And so it created this feeling of desperation. And so from the 1960s, the 70s to 80s, and even into the early 90s, there was just a drain of Black talent, students who grew up in Oklahoma, and all that their grandparents and parents instilled in them is get an education and then get out of here.
But over the last 20 years, things have started to change in Tulsa. Rebuilding and development has returned. Entrepreneurs and business folks are also coming back. Phil describes it as the third rising of Greenwood. Trey has noticed it too. It's part of the reason why, after school, he decided to stay in Tulsa rather than leave.
I played basketball growing up, and playing pickup, you might lose a game. You can either run it back or pick up a new squad. I like to run it back. So for me, I feel like if I'm here and playing it here for a reason, that I can be part of that change moving forward.
Trey is part of a cadre of Black entrepreneurs forming a new innovation ecosystem in Tulsa, one that is very intentionally trying to center Black creativity and prosperity from the start.
So I think we're on a precipice of being able to kind of change and be at the forefront of what we want the future of Tulsa to look like.
Welcome to City of the Future, a podcast from Sidewalk Labs. Each episode, we explore the ideas and innovations that can transform cities. We're your hosts. I'm Eric Jaffe.
And I'm Vanessa Quirk. And in this episode, we're talking about how a new generation of innovation ecosystems could not only spur economic growth, but offset some of the urban development approaches that have left African Americans in particular behind.
These are ecosystems that could revitalize underserved neighborhoods and distribute the benefits of economic growth and prosperity more equitably for all.
Okay, so we've been throwing out this term innovation ecosystems as if everyone knows what that means. But not everyone does. So, Eric, you've written a lot on this topic. Would you mind telling the good listeners, what the heck an innovation ecosystem is?
Sure. Innovation ecosystems are places where companies and anchor institutions, those are things like universities or big research centers, cluster and they connect with startups, incubators, and smaller accelerators. Now, these can be tech ecosystems, they can be biomedical ecosystems, whatever the focus is. No matter the type, the idea is the same. By being so close to one another, these different parts of the economy can more easily collaborate and connect and share information and ideas with each other.
And probably attract a lot of talent and resources, and therefore maximize their potential for growth and innovation, right?
Right. And so in the past few decades, as technology has become core to our economy, you've seen big coastal cities like Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle become big tech innovation hubs. And that's to the point where they've created this kind of gravitational pull that attracts more and more talented workers and startups and investment capital from across the country and the world every year. And often this talent gets pulled away from smaller cities in the heartland, places like Tulsa.
And while I'm sure that did have negative impacts on the smaller cities in the heartland, I'd also imagine that it had positive effects for all the bigger coastal cities, right? As you get talent and resources, you're also getting restaurants and apartment buildings and other amenities.
And that's exactly right. You get a whole supporting culture and a whole local economy built around these innovation ecosystems.
But despite all of the growth that these tech-based innovation ecosystems have spurred, the resources on the capital have not been shared equitably, especially across racial lines. I mean, just think about the fact that of all the venture capital raised for tech in 2020, Black founders received only 0.6% of it.
Yeah, not only that, but as we've seen in these big coastal cities, this new wealth can actually create big challenges for people of color and for lower income groups. So if you take San Francisco, for example, the creation of housing there, it hasn't kept up with the influx of new workers. Now that's caused rents and housing prices to skyrocket, and that prices out a lot of the people who either were living in the city beforehand or who might want to move to the city to take advantage of new job opportunities there. These are groups of people that are essential to making a city work. Teachers, nurses, police, firefighters. They can't afford to live there anymore.
And then add on to that the complication that, for example, as San Francisco has gotten more unaffordable, people have left the urban core and moved out to the suburbs. And now they're commuting potentially hours in their cars, losing precious time and emitting carbon and pollution in the process.
That's exactly right. So, as we can see, at least with San Francisco, there are certainly pros and cons to building an innovation ecosystem.
But there's a global trend happening now to intentionally plan innovation ecosystems in a way that still brings the advantages of innovation and jobs, but that attempts to circumvent the inequities that have resulted from them in the past.
And that's a big deal because by creating walkable, mixed-use innovation ecosystems in neighborhoods that might have experienced historic disinvestment or unemployment, we can create opportunities for folks who live in these areas so they can not only stay in their communities, but also generate wealth over time.
Exactly. And to learn more about these innovation ecosystems 2.0, if you will, I actually went to visit one that's emerging right at Innovation Ground Zero.
So I used to live right there at 847. And here in the back, we learned how to play baseball. We learned how to play football. This is where the first, kiss with the girl. This is where the first fight, everything happened, right here in the back. And it was a community where sometimes when you're coming home from school and you do something wrong and you get a whooping by Mrs. Johnson here and then Mrs. Smith here, and your parents already knew by the time everyone took care of each other.
That's Landon Taylor, the co-founder of Legacy First Partners, a management consulting company that takes on projects with the potential to affect positive change in the world. I met Landon at his former home, Freedom West, a co-op housing complex made up of cute 1970s-era low-rise apartment buildings with maroon-colored balconies. The homes are located in the historically black Fillmore district, just a few blocks from San Francisco's City Hall. Landon's family lived in the Fillmore in the 40s, when redlining made it one of the only neighborhoods available to African Americans. But then in the 1950s, just like in Tulsa, an urban renewal plan destroyed much of the neighborhood, displacing tens of thousands of people and over 800 businesses.
My aunt Toogie had one of those businesses that they said, look, we're going to make this place better. Promise you, you'll be able to come back. That promise was not kept.
But in the 60s, a local pastor at Bethel AME Church, J. Austell Hall, came up with an idea to help African Americans return to this neighborhood by creating a cooperative housing complex. It would create affordable housing and generate economic empowerment by giving folks a chance to own a share in the complex. In 1973, Freedom West opened its doors, and in 1976, Landon's family moved in.
And despite going on around it, where a lot of crime and violence was happening around us, in this community, it was a safe haven. And I think a lot to the success that I was able to enjoy because of the foundation of where I was here. I was able to go to a really great school, Lowell High School, across the city. I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have an affordable place to live. And so I was that guy who I fortunately got some success, moved away, and I hadn't talked to the board or members for a long, long time.
Landon was living far away from Freedom West when one day he got a call.
My childhood friend Richard saying, can you come? We're about to lose our property. So I, of course, next week I was on the plane, flew up, sat with them, listened to everything that was going on.
In those conversations, Landon learned that Freedom West had been struggling for years. From the beginning, HUD and the city had not provided them the capital or training necessary to keep up with building maintenance. Their finances were getting grimmer by the year, and all the while, the real estate value of the land was skyrocketing. From the late 1990s and going into the early 2000s, tech companies came to San Francisco and changed the real estate dynamics. The neighborhood next to Freedom West, called Hayes Valley, changed almost beyond recognition.
It's predominantly all Caucasian. And a condo there is, $1 million, one bedroom, minimum.
While tech workers benefited from the transformation, African Americans and other long-term residents were getting displaced, and not just in Hayes Valley, but throughout the city. Landon and the rest of the community at Freedom West did not want to be next. They knew they needed a redevelopment plan to preserve what they had and create a more sustainable future.
And those guiding principles became this. Number one, the developer has to deliver 382 brand new units at no additional monthly housing costs to the residents, despite a modest 3% annual increase. Number two, a 40-year economic self-sustainability model and plan that includes additional sources of income. And then number three, unlike what happened with urban renewal, the community must have input in the design of the overall community and development plan.
That's when Landon called Victor MacFarlane, the founder and CEO of MacFarlane Partners, and a developer with decades of experience. He invited him to come sit in on one of their 8-hour-long community sessions.
There was a lot of distrust. They've been taken advantage of, and they didn't know me from Adam. Luckily, I was being introduced by someone who was raised here and they had a lot of faith and trust in. But, I think the key is what we committed to up front was transparency,
Like Landon, Victor had come from humble beginnings to achieve great professional success, and he believed in this project and why it mattered. So Victor committed to the guiding principles and came up with a plan to not just preserve the co-op housing, but to redevelop Freedom West's 10 acres with commercial and retail spaces and market rate housing to generate income for the entire community. And at the heart of the plan is an innovation center.
A STEM-focused innovation center that allows the residents to have access to job training, entrepreneurship training, and access to capital to allow them to participate in the 21st century economy. Because that now allows them to plug in and now address the wealth gap, the income gap, and now you've got this thriving overall community.
Because San Francisco is a well-established innovation ecosystem, there's no shortage of companies, startups, and business accelerators that Landon can tap into. In fact, as we speak, he's meeting with companies who want to be a part of Freedom West 2.0.
A lot of the companies, we've talked to the tech companies who said, oh, we'd love to hire African Americans. We'd love to hire Latinos or women. We just can't find the talent. We're going to strip away that excuse. Instead of there being a rift or tension or conflict between the city and tech, we think we could be a starting point of pulling people together and saying, let's have the community participate. And let's have industry participate in the community in the way they say they would like to, but haven't figured out the right model.
So through this innovation center, residents will be connected to the job opportunities generated by the companies and businesses that move into the neighborhood.
Right, by physically co-locating residents with tech companies and funders, they're hoping to create a more equitable innovation ecosystem right in the Fillmore district.
One of the things that we heard from one of the board members, he said, I want my daughter, who's 7 years old, I want her to be sitting at the innovation center at a little table so that she's working on her project. She turns to her friend whose dad is runs Salesforce, says, oh, I like that project. Why don't you come over to my house? Let's do some rapid prototyping on it. And then the dad says, no, come on here, let's fund it. Because that's what happens every day. No, let's be real. That's what happens every day for, the Stanford student. That's not what happens in this community. So that's what I would say about what needs to be done differently. Don't just build a co-op that's segregated. Let's have this complete integrated model that brings public-private together and that creates an engine that is sustainable for the future.
That integration isn't the only thing that's different about this project. Victor has structured the development deal so that as the neighborhood thrives and generates money for him and his development company, the residents of Freedom West will benefit as well.
This nonprofit co-op will participate in the profits that are generated by the for-profit developer in the market rate component. So usually it's this big fight about, I don't want the developer. No. We want the developer to make as much money as possible because they get to participate. And so I would like to be so bold to say what we're doing for this community is to put them in the driver's seat to participate in real estate development in the way that usually only wealthy white developers or landowners have.
This is a potentially transformative way to approach development. And like some of the models that we talked about in our first 2 episodes of this season, it's yet another innovation that aligns developers with community members, giving both sides an opportunity to benefit from the wealth that new development generates.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, it's not without risk for Victor and his company, right? Like, this is part of the reason why he and Landon are currently appealing to the city so that they can help make the financing pencil out in the long run.
It makes me wonder, is Victor unique here? I mean, would other developers be willing to go this far in working with the community?
Well, I actually asked Victor and Landon just that question, and their answers were pretty fascinating. What do you say to other developers if they say, like, oh, dealing with the community, it's just more risk for me. It's more draws out my timelines. Like, why should I even bother? What do you say to that kind of developer?
We've had some development friends and partners who've had projects stopped because they didn't go through that community engagement process. That would make the point that if you don't take the time to listen to the community, that it could end up costing you more from a time perspective. But also, institutional investors, are starting to look carefully at where they're placing their capital. Do you have some sort of an approach, around ESG? So I think that there's a lot afoot now, and I think it's those developers that get that, it can make it a part of their business strategy. I think that can be a competitive advantage.
We need people to step up. Yes, they're going to have to risk some money up front. We and the community are risking money up front to prove a case to make something special. So I challenge others to just say, take a risk. Set the amount of money you're willing to lose, but give it a go.
Right, take the risk to be transformative.
Yes, and to feel really good about yourself and make money at the same time.
It's truly inspiring what Victor and Landon and the community together are doing at Freedom West 2.0. But the financing will be a challenge, right? Land prices in San Francisco are incredibly high, and there's a lot of upfront capital to risk.
And not only that, but the inequities there are long-standing. This is not something that can be fixed overnight. But Victor and Landon believe that in the next few decades, Freedom West 2.0 will empower this community and catalyze multi-generational wealth.
It definitely makes me wonder, what about creating an innovation ecosystem almost from scratch, right? Could you potentially circumvent some of the mistakes of the past?
Well, remember how I went to Tulsa at the top of this episode?
I do.
Well, there's a group of folks there who I met who are trying to do exactly that, to bake equity into an innovation ecosystem right from the start.
I've had a lot of great opportunities in life. This is the first one where my mom said, I'm proud of you. I want to do right by her. And do right by this community and really Black people across the country.
That's really powerful that your mom said that. That's really special.
Well, I worked for President Obama. That wasn't good enough for you?
That's Randy Wiggins, the founding managing director of a company called Build in Tulsa. I met Randy outside a barbecue joint in Greenwood so he could show me around the neighborhood.
So we can walk by them.
And as we walked, Randy told me his backstory. He got his start in finance, then moved to the public sector where he worked for the Obama administration, and then transitioned to venture capital. When we arrived at the Build in Tulsa HQ, just a few blocks away from historic Greenwood Avenue, he told me more about his company and how it's creating an innovation ecosystem of Black entrepreneurship in the city.
We're bringing in entrepreneurs at every level of their entrepreneurial journey and providing them with first-in-class support.
To support these entrepreneurs, Build in Tulsa has created 3 different accelerators, each focused on companies at different stages of their development. And these accelerators provide the knowledge, the mentorship, and the connections to capital that these companies will really need to take off.
We want to build the most Black entrepreneur-centric ecosystem in the country and in the world. And, in the same way that people, want to get to Silicon Valley, if you're a Black BIPOC entrepreneur, you'll be wanting to get to Tulsa in the same way.
Unlike San Francisco, Tulsa doesn't have the benefit of an established innovation ecosystem or an established talent pool. So one of the first steps will be to reverse the brain drain that's happened in Tulsa since urban renewal and get new startups, entrepreneurs, and talented folks to move to Tulsa, just like Randy did.
Yeah, and as we know from our episode on remote work last season, Tulsa's attracting a lot of new folks these days.
That's right. In fact, while I was talking with Randy, he walked me down the hall to introduce me to somebody else who had just recently made the move.
My name is Brian Brackeen. I'm the general partner of Lightship Capital. Lightship Capital is a $50 million venture fund focused on women and minorities, and one of our headquarters is Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Brian told me that the story of Tulsa makes it the perfect place to create a new kind of Black-centered innovation ecosystem.
We are big fans of Tulsa 1920, right? So when we think about the work we do here, it's about how do we recreate what was before the race massacre, right? You certainly should never forget the pain of the race massacre, But what are we trying to get back to? What is the goal? That's a vibrant, thriving North Tulsa.
And so what brought you to Tulsa, apart from Randy's good convincing here?
Yeah, Randy's fine looks. No, no. We took a tour in 2019 called the Comeback Cities Tour. It was co-sponsored by Bloomberg and some others.
I think I read about that. It was like a VC type thing to different cities around the quote unquote heartland, right?
Exactly. Get coastal VCs to come visit heartland locations to see what's really going on. And so when we got here, it was literally the nicest people, the kindest people we'd ever met anywhere. People talked openly about the race massacre and what they were trying to do. In casual conversation, they'd really normalized in a way they live it. And then 3, the quote unquote powers that be were very focused on doing whatever they had to do, whether it be financially or through just their own voice, to help us to fix things. So I come for the tour, I stay for life, right? I think that's a common refrain in Tulsa.
But after attracting outside talent and keeping Tulsa-born talent and helping their businesses and startups to succeed, the next challenge for Randy will be to create a place. When I asked Randy what that future Black Wall Street might look like, he took me out of the office. We walked north, past the stores and restaurants of Greenwood Avenue, and towards the loud and rumbling highway that divided and destroyed this neighborhood decades ago.
This is something that I hope, 10 years from now will not be here.
Right, because before the highway was here, this was all Greenwood, right? This was
all Greenwood.
On the other side of the highway, they were mostly empty fields, tall grasses. Apart from the hum of the highway, you could hear the crickets making their music and industrial trains passing by in the distance. And Randy walked me toward a field with a fence. Beyond it, there was an old decaying factory.
So this is Evansville 2. This is an 11-acre parcel, which has a 120,000 square foot factory on it. When I came here, I said one of the things that we need to have if we're going to be competitive is our own campus. The expectation is for housing. The expectation is for restaurants. How do we build this into really a modern day, all-purpose factory that produces successful entrepreneurs, but that also produces economic growth and also produces racial and economic justice?
To do that, they're starting preliminary conversations with the community. And 2 of the themes that have already come up are ownership and inclusion.
And we know what we desire to have is something that will be owned, if not in part, then in its entirety or in some form or fashion, by the community. We think that that's right. And I think inclusiveness, right? So many times, I think people in the community, they say, we just want to make sure that we're being thought about, we're being considered, we're being engaged.
Is it possible to imagine that the Freedom West model could be applied here?
Yeah, or maybe even a neighborhood REIT or a community investment trust, right? But it's still too early to know what they're going to land on. Randy is currently looking for a developer who will be willing to work with them to make sure that the community benefits from the wealth that is generated here, so that they can create a more equitable innovation ecosystem, one that prioritizes Black prosperity for the long term, so that Greenwood can rise once again.
Let's be completely honest. This is not compared to the acres and acres and acres of property that were destroyed in the Tulsa Race Massacre. But this is a start. And I think from this can come beautiful things. So it's not much to look at right now, but it's what it represents in the future to me that is so beautiful and so inspiring.
Thank you for listening to City of the Future, a podcast from Sidewalk Labs. Your hosts are Vanessa Quirk and me, Eric Jaffe. A big thanks to all the guests who made this episode possible. Phil Armstrong, Trey Thaxton, Landon Taylor, Victor MacFarlane, Randy Wiggins, and Brian Brackeen.
Thank you to Allison Novak, Jesse Shapens, and Crystal Dean from Sidewalk's development team. And thanks as always to our producer, Guglielmo Mattioli, our advisor, Benjamin Walker, and our mixer, Andrew Calloway.
Story editing by Rough Cut Collective. Our music is by Adam James Levin Arady of Lost Amsterdam. Our social media and transcripts are by Jamie Lee Hogland. And our art is by the great Tim Cow. We'll see you in the future.
Bye.